Honestly, it didn't click for me until I was sitting with an endocrinologist at the beginning of the year who is a physician, obviously, and works with a lot of oncology patients, specifically breast cancer survivors. And I was sitting and talking to her about all of this, and she just sat there and she just said to me, and I know I've heard this from other people, but she said, Avanti, you're being really hard on yourself. You physically are a different person than you were a year ago. And I don't know what it was about the way she said it to me, but it suddenly clicked. And I was like, oh, yeah, I am. Physically, I am a different person. So why can't I give myself some grace and some space to sort of get to know that person that I am now rather than continually thinking about the person I was and comparing all the time to the person I was or the person I think I should be. It's sort of that idea of what you were talking about, right? And I think what she was also inviting me to do was to actually create a new normal. She said, how about you create a new normal for yourself? Because I was like, I just want to get back to normal. I just want to get back to normal. That's what I was saying to her. And she said, okay, let's create a new normal. And I was like,
Yeah.
shit, she's right. And that's that pause that we were talking about earlier. It's like,
Mm,
take a pause and create a new normal for yourself. It's okay.
mm.
That
It's
was
yeah.
transformative for me. It really was. It helped me so much.
I mean, it sounds like you had sort of a lightning bolt of
Mm-hmm.
mindfulness to the moment
Yeah.
along with self-compassion, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that feels like it's so relevant for so many of us in even
Mm-hmm.
different situations in terms of losing loved ones and it being
Yeah.
not the same life anymore,
Right.
or going to new jobs, or our children moving out and going to school or leaving the house.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
there's just so many ways that I think we can be who we were.
Right.
We've lost something,
Mm-hmm.
and now it's time for us to find who we are now.
Right. Yeah. And I actually think that this actually even happens when we like receive news of anything. So what I'm
Mm,
thinking about is like, we get a diagnosis or we get some bad news or we get some good news, right? There's that change that's happening right there. And it's again resetting our new normal to the information we just got. It could be just like a micro change. It doesn't have to be something as big as what I was talking about, that's very, very sort of obvious and like visually obvious, right? But it could be something so small. Like you get the news that, like you said, a loved one passed away. What do you do with that?
mhm.
Right? Can you create a new normal in the sense of, and this doesn't mean you go back to business as usual, not that kind of new normal, but sort of, can you allow yourself to be in a new place that you have never been in before or weren't in before?
Yeah. Or to understand that your grief and your present sadness and suffering around this loss is going to transmute that place of where you were to where
Right.
you are, right? That
Yeah.
knowing that that's almost the alchemy right there, is the
Right.
sadness has its own purpose, right? And just be
Hmm.
with it. It
Hmm.
sounds like you were just in that moment really with where you are.
Hmm. Yeah, I really did. I really did take a pause. And actually, it's interesting as we're saying this, because for me, that pause actually was getting on a plane and going to India. I
Mm.
actually talked to you about this, I
Yeah.
think, is
Yeah.
that for me, going to India for 3 weeks was, yes, a year of yes. I can say all those fun things like, it's my year of yes. But what it was, and I didn't even realize what it was until after, and now I'm reframing it in this way that we're talking about it, is that it was a pause for me to have some space to go from one place to the next, to transition from treatment to post treatment. I didn't realize that that's what I was doing when I decided to go to India, because it was just creating a different environment for me, some different routines, being around different people, having a different perspective, all of those things when you travel. And for me, going to India after 5 years was that really felt like what it was. And I just came back feeling different. Even though
Mm.
I have my ups and downs every day of like, oh, I'm having this ache, I'm having that pain, like things that I never had to deal with before. But I just fundamentally have had that space to transition from what was to what will be, what can be. So for me, it was like that trip.
That's so
Mm.
interesting because I think that, that encompasses this first step we're talking about just accepting that change is here, that
Yeah.
it is here and
Right.
it is happening. And then really it speaks to the second step we talked about, which is to create intention around the
Yeah.
transition.
Mhm.
So you don't have to go to India or,
Right. Of
take a
course.
big trip, but
Yeah.
what you did unknowingly maybe, but now you
Mhm.
recognize is you
Mhm.
created an intention
Right.
that I need some space
Mhm.
to embrace and live this change, to
Right.
pause and notice
Right.
where I am going.
Yeah.
And so, this second idea of creating intention, think about now how that changes you for future changes, for future
Mhm.
transitions. I
Mhm.
bet just recognizing what you did with that trip will help you mark an intention in the future around a big transition, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. And it's so interesting because we do this in small ways in Western society, right? We have a graduation ceremony, we have a baby shower, we have a wedding, whatever, a wedding shower, all these things, which are beautiful ways to mark the transition. But I think what is missing many times is that it's more about the celebration or the event that marks it rather than the intention.
Mm,
I feel like sometimes that is a piece that is missing, and that can be hard for people because they feel like they had this thing but they're still not ready
yeah.
for that transition. I don't know how to explain it. Like you were telling me about the way that you marked the transition of having your children. Can you
Yeah.
share that
Yeah.
with us?
Yeah, I mean, this was a practice introduced to me by a mutual friend of ours,
Mhm.
and it's called a blessing way, which it comes from indigenous practices. And it was a way, instead of a baby shower, it was a way to bring community and specifically your female motherhood community. And that doesn't
Mhm.
mean everyone has to be a mother, but just this sort of idea about bringing women and
Mhm.
understanding how we birth things and ideas and people into the world.
Right.
And so we created a circle. Everyone brought a very special stone or, gem or some object
Mhm.
and gave me a blessing on it and gave
Mhm.
me a blessing for me as a mother and for my child and I. And then we beaded them on a necklace. And then
Mhm.
that necklace was something I wore when I gave birth to my children. Two times I had a necklace, one time a bracelet, but I wore this
Mhm.
piece of jewelry and I still have them. And I do my own personal blessing on them every year on that child's birthday. They don't know that, but I do
Mhm.
do that. And it was such a special, not only a way of marking it beautifully and bringing community together, but it
Mhm.
was this way of creating an intention that, oh, wait, I'm about to become a
Right.
mother.
Right.
This is quite sacred. And
Mhm.
even, for all three of my children, it was, I'm about to be a mother to two children.
Mhm.
I'm about to have a third child. What does
Right.
that mean for me and my
Right,
family,
right. Because
And
that's a
so,
transition too, not just even having another baby, but going from 1 to 2, 2 to 3,
right.
right?
What does that mean for my partner? What does that
Yeah.
mean for me? And each time it really allowed me to settle into the pause, like we were saying about
Mhm.
transitions,
Yeah.
and to be with it in a way that felt really sacred and out of the ordinary, because no
Mhm.
transition is ordinary. We are moving from what was to what can be. And
Right.
that space is sacred no matter what is happening,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I really like this. You know what I'm thinking about also is even on a micro level, like when we talk about having daily routines, like having a nighttime routine, that is marking a transition. Right? I mean,
Yeah.
you're creating it might be the same thing you're doing every day, and that's fine, but you're also taking yourself from the day to the evening to sleep, right? So you're like transitioning again, and you're doing whatever, you're having a cup of tea or you're journaling or you're doing a prayer, whatever it is, you're marking it with an intention.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's what sets it apart from being just a routine or a habit.
Yeah.
And I actually wrote about this last week in my Substack. I call them micro rituals in a way that
Hmm.
they're all, they may seem so small that you may not feel like you can ascribe the word ritual to them.
Right.
But I disagree. I think
Right.
that the more intention you bring to that ritual, as micro as it is, the more it marks this movement between different spaces.
Yeah. Yeah. And what I'm thinking about now is that that is such a important way to regulate our nervous system on a daily basis. But then, even in this transition time, these big things we were talking about, me going from, treatment to post treatment, I created that time for my nervous system to settle in a little bit, something
Mhm, mhm.
from where I was to where I'm going, right? And you do the same thing. Like, I mean, right? When
Yeah,
you were having your babies and you were
yeah,
doing a blessing way, that was a time for you to sort of settle in and
yeah.
transition from one thing to the next.
And
I
I
never
think
thought
about
about
this
that.
in the
Yeah.
workplace, because I think about it as, all 3 times when I went back to work after
Mhm.
having my babies and being in a workplace where many women had babies and came back, I always felt like we're missing something because the
Right.
first day back, I would come back
Yeah.
and it was such an abrupt, harsh transition
Yep.
and really could have been softened by somebody just taking a moment to honor that I've just been through. And
Yeah.
I don't mean just me, we should have done this for all the women
Right.
who had
Sure.
babies. How do we not have a micro ritual around that? Like welcoming someone back and honoring that they've created life while they've been
Right.
gone and
Right.
that now they're creating this space to come back to us as a new person. I mean, there are ways that we could soften the blow of our ridiculous maternal leave policies. I'm
Right.
not saying they solve it, but
Right.
there are things that we do not think about or understand as ways to
Right.
be inclusive.
Right, right. And it's again comes back to this idea of, you know, really understanding that we all go through these transitions and how do we support each other through those, right? And mark them and ritualize them and again create that space because what you're talking about is that it's like business as usual. There was no time to actually take a moment to acknowledge that because we're so worried about being productive and
Yeah.
doing, right? So let's just jump right back into, our rounds and see all the patients and there we go, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's talk about the third thing because this actually goes along with the second. So the first was accepting, the first step is sort of accepting impermanence. The second was creating intention and marking it. And the third was harnessing community. That's what we wanted to talk about. Tell me about what you think about this one.
Yeah, I mean, I think change is scary no matter how you look at it, even when we welcome it. And so, I mean, taking this example of a mother coming back to work, that's scary. Who's taking care of my baby? How will I function? How will I breast pump? That's what I was trying to figure out between
Right.
patients. It's
Yeah.
stressful.
Yeah.
And it takes community to allow us to not only regulate our nervous system, but to be supported through that challenge and to
Mhm.
know that we are not alone. It actually, the connection of community helps set that vagal tone to remind us that we are held and safe and in somebody else's mind and heart
Mhm.
as well. And so I think that example we just used of how we do not welcome mothers back to the workplace is a place where we are
Right.
lacking community and
Right.
connection. But there are other ways, if you think about it, I have a very good friend going through a divorce right now. It's quite brutal and painful.
Mhm.
And there's no ritual of community around a divorce. We all come together for the
Mm.
wedding. And then when it falls apart, even 25 years later, as this one, then we all maybe you hear about it, or if you're her good friend, but we don't have a way of community coming together to support her through it. I've been thinking about this a lot.
Mm,
And so there are just some ways that we have lost that sense that none of us were meant to do this alone.
right,
I ever. We were
right,
never meant to heal alone.
right,
And so the idea of transitions being fostered and held in community, I think
right.
is not something that's been studied in a randomized controlled trial, but I think we do know the value in
Yeah,
trials from community for longevity
right.
and for health span
Hmm.
and for well being.
Right,
So why wouldn't we want to harness that during a
right.
transition?
Yeah, I think that's so interesting. Two things I'm thinking about is that sort of these events that we think of negatively, that we think are negative, but are just a fact of life. Death is one
Mhm.
of them. In Western culture, we don't want to talk about it. We just don't want to go there. We'll celebrate it at a funeral, but before it happens, during that transition time, when someone is transitioning from health and being alive to dying, we don't want to talk about it, right? We're missing so much there, right? And that
Yeah.
community. But even your example of, someone going through a divorce, why is it that we're not like marking that transition, but not only just marking it, but like talking about it and being in it, right? I
Yeah.
that's an interesting one. But then if you look at the sort of quote positive way, right? With having a baby, right? We'll have this baby shower and the celebration. But what about that transition, that true transition from maybe not having a child to now having a child, or maybe going from one child to children, right? That space that in many, indigenous cultures, including our own that we come from, South Asia, there is a huge piece of community that happens of support in that transition time. Like for example, when we have babies as South Asian women, our mothers and our aunts and our sisters, they all come and they take care of us and they're feeding us this, that, and the other to
And they
help
make
with.
certain foods even.
Yes, exactly. That to help us, have our milk come in, to nourish us, to rebuild our tissues, right? They're doing all these things to help us in that transition time. That is not the norm in Western culture to have that. I mean, it used to be, but in modern society, it's not. We just like, have a baby and then we move on,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Or
Yeah.
or someone dies and we have a funeral and then we move on. Like, let's
Yeah.
talk about that.
Yeah. I mean, which part of it? There's so much
I don't know.
there.
I mean, that it's just something that has always bothered me about these like how we do this. And it's again, I'm not trying to, sort of, criticize our way of marking transitions, but I feel like we mark the transitions, but then we forget about the actual transition and the support we need during the transition.
Yeah, I mean, it's making me think that what are the structures or frameworks, the scaffolding that could be in place so that that would
Mhm.
be easier, because you don't want it to fall on the person in the
Right.
middle of the transition,
Sure.
that it's the onus on them to ask for
Mhm.
community to come to them. I
Right.
do think that's a possibility. I'm not saying we
Right.
maybe in the transition from not having the scaffolding to having the scaffolding,
Right.
we should maybe all be asking for more help as well. I think that's a
Right.
valid tool.
Mhm.
But what I would hope and wish for is the scaffolding to be in place so that, honestly, I'm thinking about my friend right now and thinking about how, oh, maybe I could have reached out to her community and said, let's come together, and we don't even have to have something we have to do. Let's just all pick a day for the next month that we go and visit. Like,
Yeah.
how is it that we cannot leave her unsupported,
Mhm.
right? It doesn't even have to be a meal train all the time
Right.
or a thing to do. It can
Right.
just be a drop by.
Mhm.
And so our daily life isn't set up for that to be a sort of natural inclination. But I think that, like I'm thinking about that's something I'm going to change for myself.
Yeah.
What if we set that up? I can't stop by every day, but we can
Mhm.
as a community do that for a
Mhm.
while, right?
Yeah, and you know what I'm thinking about is that I don't know, my grandfather just popped into my head. He at the end of his life, the last 10 years or whatever, he had this habit, or I mean this ritual that he did every day. He would go around the neighborhood and hang out with his friends or have chai with somebody. And, it strikes me that that ability to connect in that way with people in your community was an opportunity to support people through transitions, because then you heard about them, you talked about them, right?
Yes.
And you gave advice and thoughts and shared, you know, someone's tears or someone's laughter, right? We don't do that anymore, most of us, right? In
Right.
daily life, it's harder to do because of the modern world. Again, that productivity and doing a bazillion things. How many times do we have that opportunity to just sit down with someone, like walk over to someone's house and sit down with them and have a cup of tea and just talk?
Yeah. So it's making me think that the pause is not only individual, but it's communal.
Yeah. And how can we start to create some structures in society? But let's even just start with ourselves. Like, how could we start to create some structures in our own lives to have that space,
Yeah.
right? To have that pause. So, whether it's like saying, you have a weekly family dinner or a weekly family meal or a weekly family walk in the park, whatever it is, right? That space, that like sort of almost ritualizing it and creating that touchstone. We've talked about this too.
Yes.
It's like for nervous system regulation, we create these touchstones throughout the day to help settle our nervous system. Well, if we could do that, you know, as a space once a week or once every couple of days, whatever you can do, creating some structure as a touchstone of a time where you can share and have that pause for whatever transition you're going through.
Yes.
How would that change how we look at transitions and changes?
There would be more space for them to happen.
Yeah.
There wouldn't be as much pressure on them, right?
Mhm.
Because
Mhm.
part of what transitions it feels hard is that they have to, like we said, happen in a certain amount of time.
Right.
I need to get over it, or I need to get, adjusted. And
Mhm.
maybe there's just too much pressure on the transition to occur.
Yeah.